Welcome back. We are shifting this week from West Africa over to East Africa. And in particular, we're talking about coastal East Africa, the area of the Swahili people or Swahili culture. It's a primarily a narrow coastal strip along the coast inhabited by these people. I want to say your textbook chapter on this for this week, I think is quite good. And except for one exception, I'm not going to give you a lot more information because there's a lot in here already. But I do want to talk about a few things. I'm also just want to point out they focus in here, starting on page 132, on historical methodology. How do we know about the past? What kind of sources do we have? Things like that. And they use Kilwa as a case study. And what I want to point out to you is the primary sources that I gave you for this week are the exact ones that they talk about in here. So it would be a very good thing for you to do is to read those sources and then read what they say about them. Okay, so for example, you have that recorded Swahili oral history about the Shirazi. Okay, and they talk about that on pages 132 and 133. So I would read that maybe a couple of times. It's only a page long, and then read what they say about it. And then similarly, I gave you also a one-page document from our old friend Ibn Battuta, right? Who we saw last week was in the Mali Empire. Well, he's was a world traveler in the 15th century. So he also before he was in Mali, he made his way over here, and they talk about that document on the bottom of 134 to 135. So read that carefully and then see what they have to say about it. And then finally, the third document I gave you this week, the Barbosa document, is actually not about Kilwa, but it mentions Kilwa. He's focusing in that document on Mombasa, which is one of the Swahili city-states just up the coast. But he does mention Kilwa and compares the two of them together. So we got quite a bit of information this week on Kilwa. Let's see what we have going on here. All right, so just to give you some orientation, when we're looking at the Swahili, and Swahili, we talk about Swahili or the Swahili. It's a people, it's a cultural group, it's a language, and so on. And it's a group of Africans who lived right along the East African coast and on a number of offshore islands. Okay? They got established along the coast by, well, we'll see here in just a minute, by 750 or so AD. And then the height of their civilization really was about 1000 AD to about 1500. Now, the language itself, and if anybody, you may have heard of Swahili, usually it's from the Swahili language. Well, if you've seen Lion King, then you know Swahili, right? Okay, Simba is the Swahili word for lion. Rafiki is the Swahili word for friend, and so on. Anyway, the language itself has spread beyond just the Swahili people along the coast. The language has spread across East and East Central Africa, where today it's the official language in Kenya and Tanzania and Uganda. So it's quite widespread. I myself spent 4 or 5 years studying Swahili, including some time along the East African coast here. Let me see if I can go back to that. Oh, anyway, so and this is what the coast looks like. This is a picture from Zanzibar, where I spent some time studying, which is one of the islands off the coast of Tanzania. Beautiful tropical place. So I highly recommend that if you get a chance to go. And your textbook talks about this. I just want to review here. The important thing for the Swahili was trade. And trading connections they had. Now, we've talked about trade a number of times, of course. Last week, it was about trans-Saharan trade, right? Mali being connected with areas of North Africa and then on further from there. For the Swahili, though, it's going to be an Indian Ocean trading system. Okay, so they're going to have linkages, as you can see on this map, with peoples all around the Indian Ocean, up to the Red Sea, up to the Persian Gulf, Persia, Arabia, India, and so on. And that's because of the monsoon wind systems. This is a weather pattern in the Indian Ocean where the winds blow from the northeast to the southwest for half of the year, and then the other half of the year it turns around and blows the other way. Well, if you, as you did back in the day, have sailing vessels, this is perfect. This is a perfect way to get back and forth. So it really facilitates contact and trade between people on the East African coast and other peoples around here. And that's what's going to bring, well, it's going to bring traders and merchants to here, like the Shirazi in that oral history you're going to read. It's going to ultimately, the Portuguese will end up over here. But it's also going to bring Islam. And the Swahili will, after a time, after about 800 AD or so, will become Muslim. And so this is going to be an Islamic society here along the East African coast. Okay, let's dates and events. So by the 1st century AD, we have settlements along the coast. They're not probably yet recognizable as the Swahili culture. We're going to see that from about 750 or so onward. Growth of Indian Ocean trade is going to bring Islam. Islam will bring literacy and these global connections, which are going to be so important to the Swahili. That's kind of one of the messages of that oral source you're going to read about the Shirazi. It's about global connections. And then from about 1000 to 1500 AD, your textbook calls this the high point of Swahili civilization. I call it the Golden Age. And in part, that's a joke because gold is going to be an important part of what's going on here. Okay, so the big question then is not just history and what happened, but how do we know? That's a question of historical methodology. What kind of sources do we have for the past? Well, of course, once again, we rely a lot on written sources. And you have the primary source from Ibn Battuta. You have the one from Barbosa. And once again, because we have a lot of non-literate societies in Africa, so the written sources are often the earliest ones are going to be from outsiders. And that's certainly the case what we have here. Although Islam will bring literacy, and you're going to have an elite certainly in among the Swahili who are going to be literate certainly after 1000 AD. And they'll be writing Swahili using Arabic letters, using Arabic alphabet. But we don't have a lot of those older documents that have survived. So we have to rely on other things. But we do, so we have, once again, written sources, some in Arabic, like Ibn Battuta. We have Portuguese documents. We also have archaeology, oral sources, and linguistics. And the oral sources are the Shirazi reading, once again, that you have that they talk about in your textbook here. I'm going to focus on these other two, on archaeology and linguistics. So a quick picture here of a dhow. This is a classic Swahili sailing vessel that you would find in the Indian Ocean here. One of the things about the Swahili that makes it easier to reconstruct their society is they built in stone. So did obviously the ancient Egyptians, so did Ethiopians, and a few other societies around Africa, but not that many. The Swahili would build in coral blocks. There's a coral reef that runs all the way up and down the East African coast, and they go out, just cut the coral, which you shouldn't do today, okay, back then, anyway, and use it for building blocks. And so we have the remains of cities and tombs and all sorts of things, mosques, palaces, and so on, that give us a lot of information about what their lives were like. We see a number of things. This is a picture of a reconstructed house. This thing here is called a zedaka. It's basically like a china cabinet in your house, or where you would display things. But it's a way of actually showing off these imported items and your wealth. And you can see there's a baraza or a bench for socializing and meeting outside the house here. I have another picture of Zadaka. Where's my other picture? There we go. Here's some ruins on Kilwa, and you see the same thing in these ruins from, this is prior to 1500, the same sort of Zadaka there. Let me go back because we have, also on Kilwa was, as your textbook tells you, the largest enclosed space in Africa at that time was this huge mosque they built there. And this is the interior of it. Of course, it was in ruins after 1500. The Portuguese come in and sack the place. And then you can see here from another picture kind of from a distance the size of the building. And it was certainly the largest enclosed building in sub-Saharan Africa, certainly. So a pretty grand building. And because it's a mosque, obviously, which is a house of worship for Islam, we know it's a Muslim society. This is an artist's reconstruction of what Kilwa looked like before it was destroyed. Right now, it's mostly ruins, and they're doing some reconstruction there. But let's talk. I want to talk a little bit more about Kilwa, and then show you some archaeological remains. The Kilwa we're talking about is this Kilwa right here. It's an island, okay? And that's why that oral source is going to talk about the island. There's another Kilwa today, which is on the mainland. It's on a peninsula right here, but it's on the mainland here in Tanzania. And the island, which was built up, is abandoned. Once again, the Portuguese come and they sack the place, as Barbosa will tell you, just after 1500. And then after that, it is no longer inhabited. That was good for us because with nobody else living there, archaeologists could work. It's hard to conduct archaeology if you have to tear down somebody's house. But archaeologists could work there for decades, basically, uncovering the remains of houses and so on. I just want to show you just a little further south on the map. Down here is Sanje Yakati, which is a small island down here. I just want to mention that because it's because it's mentioned in the Shirazi oral source. It talks about conducting warfare on Sanje Yakati. So that's where that is, just south of Kilwa right there. Okay. Let's take a look at archaeological remains here, because they can tell us a lot about what life was like. So what archaeologists do generally, my brother's an archaeologist, so I got things directly from him here. But what archaeologists do basically is dig in the ground, right? You start at surface and you go down. And as you go down, typically the further down you go, the older it is. Okay? So the stuff that's at the deepest is going to be the oldest. And as you analyze what you find, you designate it in different levels as you start to see different things. Okay? I'll give you some examples here from Kilwa. All right? So this is the result of about 2 decades of archaeological work, by the way. So it's a lot of work. All right. So the deepest level at Kilwa, level 1, dates from about 800 AD to about 1000 AD. All right. What was life like? Well, we know some of what life was like because of what they found. Shells and fish bones. Well, you're on an island, so you're eating fish, right? Some locally made unglazed pots. Okay. Iron slag. What's iron slag? You should know from the iron making. Slag is the waste product of iron making. So that means they're making their own iron, right? Grooved blocks that are used for making shell beads. We have cowrie shells. That's important because those are from islands further out in the Indian Ocean. So we know there's some trade going on, right? And also some small amounts of pottery from Persia. So once again, so we know there's some trade that's going on, but not a lot. They're making most of their own pots. They're making their own iron. They're living on fish. and so on, right? Okay, next level. So from about 1000 AD to about 1200, we find some different pottery and bowls from Madagascar, which is a large island in the Indian Ocean. We find post holes. What are post holes? Well, when you dig a hole to put a post in, the post itself is probably wood and it rots away, but the depression of the hole from the post stays there, and you can actually identify it in the archaeological record. So what does that mean? Well, it means they're building something substantial. There's no evidence of building in level 1. They had houses, but they were probably stick structures with some mud coating and so on. But the fact that now they're making post holes either for doorways or potentially for fences or something means they're building more substantial houses. And generally that means they're wealthier. All right. And then we also see not the remains of the houses themselves, but they're building foundations using these coral blocks of coral. So when you're you're putting a foundation in, that means you're building a more substantial structure. In this case, probably houses, right? Then by the time we get to the next level, from 1200 onward, we find houses made out of stone, masonry houses. So probably these coral blocks. So it's getting even more built up, right? Larger houses, more substantial structures. Then we find a mosque that's built out of coral blocks and lime mortar. We're finding glass beads, very few shell beads. So they're not making their own beads anymore. They're buying them. And these are coming from all over, including probably some from indirectly from the Mediterranean. Larger amounts of Chinese porcelain. So they're having trade connections with China. Once again, indirectly, I think. Probably stuff goes from China to other parts of Asia to India and then on over to here. Copper coins we're finding. And we're finding spindle whorls and iron slag. Well, spindle whorls means they're spinning or making their own cloth. Once again, iron slag means they're making their own iron. So they continue to make some things. They're making cloth, they're making iron, but they're not making the shell beads anymore. They're relying on imported stuff. Okay? And then finally, from 1300 to 1505, 1505, we know the exact date because that's when the Portuguese roll up with like 20 ships and destroy the place. We find elaborate stone structures, including an extension of that mosque that I showed you. Chinese porcelain is becoming much more common, changes in style of local pottery, but no more spindle whorls, no more iron slag. Why would that be? Well, because like us, they're not making their own clothing at home and making their own iron anymore, right? They're buying it, they're buying imported goods. So just in the same way that we're going to go to Target or Walmart or whatever and buy a pot or clothing made in Indonesia or China or something, that's what they're doing. Okay, so this we can trace this development of Kilwa then over time to see how it was becoming a city. It's a urban complicated society. Once again, obviously Muslim and benefiting from long distance trade until once again it's destroyed by the Portuguese. Okay, the other thing I wanted to take a look at is linguistics, because archaeology can tell us a number of things, and probably the best thing that archaeology can tell us often is dates, right? As you can see here, we can date things. The problem is archaeology also is fairly limited, especially in tropical Africa, because look at the stuff that survives. It's iron slag, it's stone, it's pottery, basically rock and some metals, and that's it. But most of the stuff that Africans would have used in their daily lives wasn't made out of rock and metal. It's made out of thatch and wood and cloth, and that stuff rots away. Okay, yes, it survives in Egypt because it's so dry there, but not in tropical Africa, right? When you got the rains and all that, okay, stuff you bury in the ground, it just rots. Okay, so archaeology can tell us some things, but the stuff that survives in the archaeological record is going to be somewhat limited. So we have to look at other sources for things, including those written sources like and Barbosa and so on. We'll have very good explanations of things. But we also can rely on linguistics. What's linguistics? Linguistics is a study of languages. And no one knows, frankly. Probably were at one time over 2,000 languages spoken across the African continent. Today we're down to probably around 1,000 or 1,200 or so. But all those languages are related to other languages one way or the other, and they're grouped by linguists into different language families. Okay, and you see Swahili over here is part of what's called the Niger-Congo B group, and those are the Bantu languages. So everything in orange on this map are all languages that are related to one another. Okay, so once again, I studied Swahili for 4 or 5 years. Then I moved to Uganda, and I studied Luganda there. And because I knew Swahili pretty well, it made learning Luganda a lot easier. Because they're in the same language family. About 20-30% of the vocabulary is about the same. Kind of like if you studied Spanish and then started studying Italian or Portuguese. Okay, it's going to be similar. Family, familia, etc. Various words that are the same. So what scholars can do then is look at lists of words, and it will tell us something about that society. Okay, and what I've got here is some basic words that almost every society has in their language, and then given you those words in Swahili and also in Luganda, since those are the 2 languages I've studied the most. And what you see is a lot of these are very similar. Okay, not surprisingly, because both of these are Bantu languages, same language family, so the words are going to be the same, right? The word for person, mtu, muntu. All right, the word for people. In Swahili, it's Watu. In Luganda, it's Bantu. The word for iron, chuma and kuma. Okay, mother, mama, mama. That's almost universal. Father, baba, tata. Salt, chumvi, munyo. Okay, well, that doesn't fit, right? Let's go through the rest here quickly. Rice, mpunga, mupunga. Cow, nyombe, ente. Well, that's not the same at all, right? Chicken, very close, kuku and koko. Goat, mbuzi, mbuzi. And book, kitabu, kitabo. Okay, so you see a number of the words on here, which are, let me see, I'll go backwards for the map. See a number of words on here, which are very similar, right? So what does that tell us? Well, once again, if a language has a word for something, then that means they probably have that item in their society, right? You don't have words for things that you don't have, okay, unless it's something you've just heard about. And generally, when you adapt a new item, you also adopt the word along with it, okay? So imagine you've got, Swahili speakers and Luganda speakers next to each other, and the Swahili speakers invent something, and Luganda speaker says, "Oh, well, what is that?" And they'll say, "Oh, it's X." And the Luganda speakers will, adopt that item and take the Swahili word along with it. Okay, by studying that, it helps us to figure out connections between people in the past. All right. But it can also be a little misleading. So you kind of have to know a little bit of history to reconstruct the history. I'll give you a couple examples here. One example is cow. Okay, in Swahili, go back here. In Swahili, the word for cow is nyombe. That's a Bantu word. We know it because it's in other Bantu languages. Also use the word cow, use the word nyombe for cow, right? But they don't use that in Luganda. Why is that? Well, the fact is that Luganda speakers are right here, right on the edge of this Nilo-Saharan group of people here. Well, these Nilo-Saharan speakers are cattle herders. So at some point, the Luganda speakers adapted cows from the Nilo-Saharan speakers and took their word for cow. Okay? So that tells us something about connections, once again, in the past, where different groups had contact and trade, and and how cattle were adopted across the continent. So that's one example. Another example down here is book. Okay, and this is where we have to be a little bit careful. Both the Swahili and Luganda speakers were originally not literate societies. Okay, they're both going to be introduced to literacy by Muslims. Okay, and so the word in Arabic for book is kitab. So they take that word, of course they adopt books, and they take the word along with it, and they Africanize it by putting a vowel at the end. So for the Swahili, it's kitabu, and for the Luganda speakers, it's kitabo. Okay, but this is where we have to be careful, because we know the Swahili speakers come in contact with Muslims, in with the rise of Islam is after 630 A.D. And so we have Muslims along the coast here, probably from 700 onward, okay, 700 A.D. onward. We know from looking at the remains of Kilwa, there's a mosque there at a certain point, right? Okay, pretty good sign of Muslims' presence. So we have Islam along the East African coast, certainly by 1000 A.D. What about the Luganda speakers? Well, we don't have coastal Muslims making it to Uganda until the middle of the 19th century. Okay? That's almost 1,000 years later. Okay? So same word, same origin from Arabic, from Muslims, but it happens 1,000 years apart. Okay? So, this is one of the problems with linguistics here is it tells us, items and something about culture, but we can't date it very well. Okay, we know at some point it happened, so then you have to rely on other sources, and that's the whole point, once again, about both this lecture and that section of your textbook talking about historical methodology. How do historians of Africa reconstruct this history? And the short answer, I know I've been going too long for a short answer at this point, but the short answer is we have to rely on a variety of sources. Okay, written sources, internal if we can, outsider accounts if we can't, archaeology, linguistics, oral epics like the Shirazi story, and so on, and put them all together to create a history of these societies. All right? Okay, that's what I want to talk about for this week. Thank you very much.